To act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high quality, and distinctive output and services which inform, educate, and entertain. That right there is the mission statement for perhaps the most well-known purveyor of both entertainment and news in the world, the British Broadcasting Corporation, more commonly referred to as the BBC. Although these are undoubtedly noble goals, has this organisation always conducted itself in ways that were in keeping with these lofty standards? Unless this is the first time you're hearing about the BBC, you'll already be aware that the answer to this question is no. There is not an organisation on the planet that has lasted for more than 100 years without being involved in a few controversies, and the BBC is no exception. In today's episode, we'll take a look at some of those controversies and the effects they had on the credibility of the organisation as a whole. With the comparatively recent introduction of AI-generated video footage, the average media consumer is coming around to the idea that just because you saw something happen in a video, it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually happened, or if it did, that it happened in the way portrayed by said video. Sadly though, the problem of misleading imagery is not a new phenomenon. In 2025, we have deepfakes. In the 1980s, they had to make do with misrepresentation. But this admittedly more crude method of deception could be just as powerful in the wrong hands. For an excellent example of this, let's take a look at the BBC's coverage of the event that would come to be known as the Battle of Orgreave. If you were born in the United Kingdom any time after the war, then chances are you will have at least some knowledge of the coal miners' strikes. If you didn't live through them personally, then you will almost definitely have heard a relative who did talk about them at length at least once. For those outside the UK, here's a brief, and we mean brief, synopsis. After the Second World War, coal was still a hugely important commodity, largely because it was used to generate the majority of the electricity used by the national grid. Unfortunately, for those who made their money mining it, many of whom came from families who had done so for generations, a combination of more advanced machinery and the introduction of electricity generating alternatives such as gas and nuclear led to a steady decline in the number of miners required to do the work. On top of that, those who were still employed in the field, not unreasonably sick of doing an exceptionally dangerous job for a pittance, had begun to demand higher wages and were more than happy to go on strike in order to get them. Perhaps the most notable of these strikes took place in 1974, when the resultant lack of coal led to both wide-reaching power cuts and the declaration of a national emergency. Understandably, this led to a fair degree of animosity between the then Conservative government and the coal miners, with this animosity rising considerably in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Thatcher, who believed that the coal miners had altogether far too much power, set about transitioning the energy sector away from coal-fired power stations and closing down quite a few mines. Obviously, this only increased the tensions between the coal miners and the government. Not only were thousands and thousands of people now out of work, but those who remained were in constant fear of losing their jobs. So, what's all this got to do with the British Broadcasting Corporation? Well, as you can probably imagine, the constant unrest frequently made the news, and given that the BBC is supposed to remain completely impartial, a lot of people were wondering if that was, in fact, what they were doing. Those who were, shall we say, slightly sceptical of the BBC's allegiances appeared to have their suspicions confirmed when, on the 18th of June 1984 at 5:40 p.m, a BBC broadcast reported on the various goings-on at the Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire. As the miners blocked the roads to prevent collection lorries from getting in or out, a savage altercation broke out between them and a large contingent of police officers. As the BBC reported, the confrontation was due to a conscious decision by the miners to use any method to stop the coke lorries. Whilst claiming that the police had attempted to disperse the group after they had come under attack, the report showed images and videos of the miners throwing things at officers, and there was even one image of someone midway through a flying kick. The report, in short, took pains to make sure everyone was aware that the police had only responded with violence after being attacked, and although this had regrettably been necessary, the force used was perfectly reasonable. Then, the ITV news was aired. Although this broadcast contained the same or similar footage, it quickly became apparent that some accidental editing had occurred in the BBC studios. For example, the miner who launched a flying kick against a police officer did so because that self-same police officer was repeatedly striking another miner in the head with his truncheon. But was the man a direct threat to the officer in question? Well, Not really. He was in fact lying on the ground at the time. It would later transpire that the police had gone in very heavy-handedly against the protesters, and it was this that started the violence. Although the BBC received a lot of public hate for this portrayal over the coming months, it wouldn't be until 1991 that they would officially accept any blame. According to a most illuminating article called The BBC and the Miners' Strike of 1984-85, coverage of the Battle of Orgreave, which can be found on journals.openedition.org and contains original footage of the BBC broadcast, along with much more information on the topic. A representative of the BBC Director General Michael Checkland told a reporter that, "In their haste to put the news together, editors had inadvertently reversed the order of what happened." Flimsy as this excuse that came after 7 years is, the article goes on to suggest there may have been something even more sinister going on. Geoffrey Goodman, former industrial editor at the Daily Mirror, has claimed that, according to his sources within the BBC, the government had instructed them to focus news coverage on violence carried out by the miners, and it was for this reason that the events had been misrepresented. Even if this isn't true, and there doesn't appear to be a huge amount of solid evidence to back it up, the BBC's account of what happened is at best negligent, even if they did change the order of events later that evening on the 9 o'clock news. If it is true though, then the corporation is guilty of pretty substantial hypocrisy. On Saturday, the 8th of July, 2023, the Sun newspaper ran the following headline: "TV exclusive, top BBC star in sex pics probe." The front page went on to say, "A top BBC star is off air while allegations he paid a teenager for sex pictures are being investigated." The well-known presenter was accused of giving the youth more than £35,000 since they were 17 in order for sordid images. The alleged victim's mother said she saw the cash used for crack cocaine. Adding further fuel to the fire, the Sun would later publish additional details accusing this anonymous star of breaking lockdown rules in order to meet with somebody that they met on a dating app. Almost immediately upon publication, social media lit up with speculation. Who was this top BBC star? Who was the accuser? Why had the Sun newspaper, not ordinarily known for its restraint, refused to publish this information? With nothing further to go on, people spent the next few days basically just having a guess. Many names were bandied about online, and as such things have a tendency to do, the situation began to get out of hand, with such prominent BBC figures as Gary Lineker and Jeremy Vine being forced to issue public statements in order to clear their names. It wasn't until 4 days later, on the 12th of July, that the mystery was finally solved. Vicky Flynn, wife of the then exceptionally popular and well-respected broadcaster Hugh Edwards, released a public statement announcing that it was her husband who was at the heart of the latest scandal. The statement went on to say that the stress from the allegations had exacerbated previously existing mental health issues and that Edwards would be remaining in hospital for the foreseeable future. At almost exactly the same time, the police released a statement in which they said that they had found no evidence of criminal activity in regard to the allegations printed in the Sun newspaper. Now, bear this wording in mind, it may be important later. Although the police appeared to be done with Edwards, the BBC, which had been asked to pause its internal investigation whilst the police did their work, still appeared to have some questions. Edwards remained suspended on full pay whilst the corporation sought answers. Before this investigation could draw any meaningful conclusions though, Edwards was arrested on the 8th of November 2023 for a different, much more serious reason. You see, quite some time before The Sun published its article, Edwards had been receiving photos from someone else, convicted paedophile Alex Williams. According to a timeline of events published much later by the BBC, 16th of December 2020, Williams sends 377 pictures and video clips over the next 16 months, including 41 children. They include 7 Category A images, the most serious classification, 2 of which show abuse involving a child between the age of 7 and 9. On the 2nd of February 2021, Williams asks whether what he's sending is too young, to which Edwards responds, telling him not to send any underage images. The final indecent image of children is a Category A film featuring a young boy sent in August 2021. Williams tells Edwards the boy is quite young looking and he has more illegal images. Edwards tells him not to send any illegal images. This could perhaps go some way to explaining why the police phrased their previous statement to specifically mention that there was no evidence in relation to the accusations in the Sun article, not that there was no evidence against him at all. Of course, this is mere speculation on our part. Edwards was charged with, and would ultimately plead guilty to, 3 charges of making indecent images of children. Before we continue, it may perhaps be useful to provide a little bit of UK legal context. The scope of activities under which somebody can be charged with the creation of illegal images is vast indeed. You don't have to be the person who took the pictures, nor do you have to participate in any abusive behaviour. In fact, as with the case of Edwards, simply knowingly receiving these types of images via email or social media and not reporting them directly to the authorities is enough. We are not in any way trying to absolve Edwards of his heinous crime. We're just answering an often asked question about the case. Although Edwards could technically have received up to 10 years imprisonment for what he'd done, the judge took into account his previously exemplary record, the fact that he had several times asked not to be sent any underage images, and both his seemingly genuine display of remorse and his confirmed ongoing mental health issues. These, along with the irrevocable destruction of his career, led the judge to issue a 6-month suspended prison sentence along with an order that he must attend a sex offenders treatment program. So, apart from the fact that Edwards had worked for the BBC whilst committing these crimes, how were they at fault? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, when the mother of the 17-year-old in the newspaper report found out what was going on, she immediately contacted the BBC and reported her concerns. Given that these concerns were raised in May of 2023 and were not actually brought to the attention of senior management until the 6th of July, many critics point out that they were not treated particularly seriously. Even though the police ultimately decided that no crime had been committed, it certainly doesn't mean that Edwards was acting appropriately. As to the second reason, many individuals were less than impressed that Edwards was suspended on full pay and remained suspended on full pay for quite a long time. The BBC's response to this was pretty much what you would expect. Obviously, it would not have been reasonable for them to dismiss him purely on the grounds that there had been unfounded accusations levelled against him, and, up to a point, this is absolutely fair. However, when senior executives were made aware that he'd been arrested for serious offences, they should perhaps have acted more decisively, but this is still a matter of much debate. Edwards would eventually resign of his own accord, citing medical advice, and there was certainly none of the pomp and fanfare you would expect when a 40-year-old veteran of news broadcasting retired. In fact, the BBC even went as far as to attempt the recovery of £200,000 he was paid whilst suspended. Unfortunately, there was no legal avenue to pursue this endeavour, and the corporation would eventually admit defeat, something that seems to have caused them some very real frustration. BBC Chair Samir Shah recently told a House of Commons committee, "We've obviously asked many times, but he seems unwilling. There was a moment that we thought he might just do the right thing for a change, then he decided not to. It's quite frustrating because I think he should have done it." In a time when more and more people are demanding answers as to exactly what their TV licence money is being spent on, none of the BBC's responses are likely to fill viewers with too much confidence. With the IDF, or Israeli Defense Force, placing a strictly enforced ban on any foreign reporting out of Gaza, many people were surprised and even perhaps a little impressed when, on Wednesday the 19th of February 2025, the BBC released a documentary entitled Gaza: How to Survive a War Zone, with the description claiming that the documentary was following the lives of 4 young people trying to survive the Israel-Hamas war as they hoped for a ceasefire, a vivid and unflinching view of life in a war zone. The documentary, mostly narrated by 13-year-old Abdullah Al-Yazouri, more than lives up to its description. Due to the previously mentioned reporting ban, the directors, Jamie Roberts and Youssef Hamash, made contact with 2 cameramen inside Gaza and controlled the project from afar. The resulting footage shows the reality of the war through the eyes of Abdullah, 10-year-old TikTok cooking channel star Renad, and 11-year-old Zakaria, who takes it upon himself to help out Al-Aqsa, the one remaining and mostly functional hospital. Although these young people show incredible bravery and resilience, talking candidly about the horrors of their day-to-day lives while still managing to portray a sense of optimism for the future, it is perhaps Zakaria who the audience feels for most. His day-to-day experiences are summed up almost perfectly in this brief extract from a Guardian review. Having appointed himself to work as a volunteer, a fixer, porter, and media liaison person, he faces a busy shift when Israeli forces raid the nearby Barej refugee camp, killing scores of Palestinians. As civilians who have suffered blast injuries or gunshot wounds stream in, little Zakaria opens the back doors of ambulances, steers gurneys, and briefs journalists, shuttling endlessly this way and that, sure-footed in the crowd. He is asked what that mess on his hands is. Blood from the injured and the dead, he announces, in the disorienting matter-of-fact tone. that all children in the film share. The whole piece is an emotional roller coaster, with the viewer being forced to appreciate the true horror of Gaza from the inside, whilst also being at least slightly uplifted by the knowledge that, for these children at least, life goes on. In spite of everything that they have been through, they hadn't given up. They continue to get up every day and do things that not only give their own lives meaning, but also help others, and perhaps most remarkably of all, still manage to find time to occasionally enjoy themselves. So how could this documentary, a documentary that was, albeit briefly, mentioned in the same sentence as various prestigious awards, come to be described by Samir Shah as a dagger to the heart of the BBC's claim to be impartial and to be trustworthy, and be removed from BBC iPlayer? Let's find out, shall we? Quite soon after the documentary first aired on BBC Two, some information about the young narrator was discovered. Rather than simply being a random child growing up in Gaza who just happened to have been found by the production team, he was in fact the son of the Deputy Minister for Agriculture in the Hamas-run government. Given that Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organisation, and the BBC not only didn't make this clear at any point during the documentary, but even worse, appeared not even to have known, then their claims of unquestionable impartiality begin to look very shaky indeed. To be clear, neither we nor the majority of critics necessarily believe that this revelation invalidates the content of the documentary. Even Dorothy Byrne, former head of news and current affairs for Channel 4, who has been highly critical of the BBC for the handling of the situation, doesn't believe that the programme was pro-Hamas, telling BBC Radio 4, "Watching it, I was struck by the efforts of balance. It contains voices who curse the leaders of Gaza." The general consensus seems to be that the Broadcasting Corporation failed to carry out due diligence and, in that failing, has severely compromised its reputation at a point in time when fewer and fewer people were already trusting them. Abdullah has recently issued a statement of his own in which he claims that his parentage played no part in anything he did for the show, and, outside of his mother signing the production company's contract, his family was not involved at all. Interestingly, he also mentioned that apart from receiving $1,000 for general expenses, he was paid no money for the 9 months' work he did on the project, which, if true, is not a great look. Failing to carry out basic background research isn't the only problem, though. The BBC has also come under fire for what has been referred to as sanitising subtitles to remove anti-Semitism and present Hamas in a better light. The documentary contains several instances of Gazans referring to Israeli forces as the Jews, but the subtitles changed the wording to read IDF or invading forces. While defenders of the BBC said that this was done to more clearly express the intended meaning, others, such as Orly Goldschmidt from the Israeli embassy in Britain, clearly disagree. The translation was not only false and deeply offensive, but it also excuses racism and does not allow viewers to see how children and Palestinians at large have been taught to hate Jews from a very young age. Due to the fact that, at the time of writing, this is all still very much ongoing, it remains to be seen whether or not the BBC, the independent production company, or indeed anyone who is involved with the project will experience any long-term ramifications. However, while speaking to members of Parliament at the same meeting during which he expressed his disappointment that the corporation had been unable to convince Hugh Edwards to return any of his salary, Samir Shah had this to say. "This is a really bad moment. What has been revealed is a dagger to the heart of the BBC's claim to be impartial and to be trustworthy, which is why I and the board are determined to ask questions. The processes, the editorial guidelines, and the standards the BBC has are very good. They're very strong. I have a worry that it wasn't so much that the processes were at fault as that people weren't doing their job. That's what we need to really establish." No matter the eventual outcome, the BBC has made it clear that they have no plans to return the documentary to iPlayer, and that this is perhaps the most disappointing thing to come out of all of this. No matter who was associated with whom, the children that appeared in the show are real, their suffering is real, their remarkable resilience in the face of adversity is real, and their stories, to be lost forever, is tragic. These days, having a mild to moderate drug habit is almost a prerequisite for individuals wishing to appear on certain shows. Obviously, these shows, such as the Joe Rogan Experience, are very definitely aimed at an adult demographic, and appearing on a child's TV show after taking cocaine is as unacceptable now as it was back in 1998 when Richard Bacon lost his job for doing just that. In many ways, Bacon's tale had the potential to be a fine example of the quintessential story of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. After starting his career as essentially the T-boy at BBC Radio Nottingham, before working his way up to the lofty heights of news reporter, he transitioned to reporting for live TV in 1996 before joining the presenting team on the BBC's Blue Peter later that same year. For those of you watching in the UK, it may seem almost impossible that there are people out there who don't know what Blue Peter is, but there are doubtless a few of you who are not privy to this beloved British institution, so we shall take a few paragraphs to enlighten you. Blue Peter first aired on the 16th of October 1958 and is now the longest running children's television show in the world. Every child who grew up in the UK will, at some point or another, have watched this show. It really does have something for everyone. Over the years, producers have convinced presenters to do everything from walking a high wire between the two highest points of Battersea Power Station to creating arts and crafts projects that made the squeezy washing up liquid bottle one of the most coveted items in a multi-child family. Not only that, but due to the show's longevity, they were able to create a giveaway item that is actually useful. The Blue Peter badge, issued to competition winners, children who participated in the show, etc. And it grants a child free access to more than 200 attractions around the country. In short, the BBC takes Blue Peter very seriously, and unlike a presenting spot on lesser children's shows, its inclusion on your CV is a genuine asset. Conversely, getting yourself fired from Blue Peter is something that will follow you for the rest of your life, and even if you manage to become successful in the world of entertainment, people will remember. So let us return to Mr. Bacon. Initially, he seemed to do well on the show. The kids appeared to like him, and there was no reason for him not to enjoy a long, illustrious career entertaining children everywhere, like so many of his predecessors. Then, 18 months after his first episode, News of the World published an article revealing that he had been spotted in a somewhat inebriated state outside of a London nightclub whilst taking cocaine. The BBC, as you can probably imagine, was less than pleased with this news. There was absolutely no way that this new face of children's television could be allowed to continue in his role, so Bacon became the first presenter to ever be publicly fired from the show. He's even been forced to return his Blue Peter badge. So serious was this betrayal that the head of children's programmes, Lorraine Heggessy, went on television herself to tell the children, "Richard has not only let himself and the team of Blue Peter down, but he's also let all of you down badly. So we have decided that Richard cannot present on Blue Peter, and he agrees that this is the right decision." Although this particular scandal doesn't rank too highly in the general scheme of things, the very fact that Bacon can't have his name appear in print without at least something about his firing appearing alongside it shows how much of a big deal it was back then. Although he has gone on to have a successful, if turbulent, career in television, he admits that this particular mistake will never leave him. In one recent interview he said, "No matter what I go on to do in my career, I could bring peace to the Middle East. Still, when I die, the top line of the obituary will be fired from Blue Peter. And I could cure COVID, and still the first line would be, he was that guy who was fired from Blue Peter, and the head of BBC One went on telly and said that thing about him." Whether or not he would have been treated as severely had such a thing happened today is a matter of lively debate online, although the general consensus seems to be that, due to the advent of social media, it probably would have been much worse. Although some of the things we have covered today have been quite bad, in the grand scheme of things, they are perhaps the metaphorical equivalent of spilling some tomato soup down your favourite white shirt at a corporate dinner. It was embarrassing at the time, everyone will forever remember that you did it, but overall, it probably isn't going to end your career. This last entry is different. What Jimmy Savile did, and the ways in which the BBC were involved, not only damaged or destroyed the lives of hundreds of people, but damaged the trust between the public and the corporation in a way that has never really healed. If we once again use the corporate dinner metaphor, it was the equivalent of drinking 7 bottles of champagne, removing your clothes, and vomiting on the spouse of the managing director. But just who was Savile, and what did he do to so damage the BBC? We are fully aware that everybody in the UK knows who Sir James Wilson Vincent Savile was, but for those of you who did not grow up with British television and radio, this exceptionally brief career synopsis might come in handy. Born in 1926 in Leeds, England, Savile's family was so poor that he left school at age 14 in order to take an office job rather than finish his education. At the age of 18, he worked in a coal mine for a while before starting up as a DJ. His radio career began in 1958 when he secured a position working for Radio Luxembourg, where he was so popular that he was eventually snapped up by the biggest radio station in the country at that time, BBC Radio 1. From there, he went on to feature heavily on TV show Top of the Pops, as well as having his own show between 1975 and 1994 called Jim'll Fix It, where he granted wishes to disadvantaged young people. By the time of his death, on the 26th of October 2011, he had been awarded an OBE and a knighthood for his prolific charity fundraising and had become a sort of unofficial national treasure for the UK. The BBC aired tributes to his career as well as showing a live broadcast of his funeral, an honour befitting such a legend. But that was not the end of the story. From very early on in his career, there had been whispers that this charming, charismatic, eccentric charity champion was concealing a darker side, and following his death and his subsequent public veneration, these whispers became voices, and those voices became screams. On the 3rd of October 2012, the ITV documentary The Other Side of Jimmy Savile exploded onto screens all across the country. The simple advertising sentence that accompanies this programme: former detective Mark Williams Thomas investigates allegations that Sir Jimmy Savile sexually abused vulnerable teenage girls, formed the basis of so many newspaper articles and social media posts that the story almost completely took over the news. Not only was there now publicly available video testimony from many people who'd been abused by Savile over the years, most of them underage at the time, but also confirmation from people with whom he had previously worked. For example, Wilfred Aff, a former BBC producer, told a story in which he spent the night on the town drinking with Savile and a 12-year-old girl. The next morning, when he called Savile in his hotel room, he discovered that the previously mentioned 12-year-old girl had spent the night there as well. This was only the start. Emboldened by the bravery of those who had forfeited their anonymity and appeared in the show, literally hundreds of former victims came forward to tell their stories. Savile's legacy, not to put too fine a point on it, was utterly destroyed. So, apart from the fact that Savile was working for the BBC whilst doing these things, how was the corporation itself involved? Simply, the BBC had, through looking the other way and in some cases allegedly covering things up, allowed a lot of this to happen. An independent report carried out by Dame Janet Smith, a former Court of Appeal judge, discovered that 3 instances of rape and attempted rape had been carried out by Savile on BBC premises, with the youngest girl she spoke to being 8 years old at the time. Although the report ultimately found that the BBC as a corporate entity was not aware of his behaviour, this was due to massive systemic failures that had been going on for decades. According to a summary of the report in The Guardian, the actual report runs more than 300,000 words and took nearly 4 years to complete, concerns had been raised less than 2 years into his BBC career. The first complaint was made in the late 1960s and concerned Savile inappropriately kissing a member of staff in Manchester. Obviously, going into the report in detail is not something we can do here, but we can provide you with a few of its conclusions. The first being that Jimmy Savile sexually assaulted 57 females and 15 boys during his time at the BBC, and staff, junior and middle ranking, were aware of Savile's inappropriate sexual conduct in connection with his work for the BBC, and of course, the part that a lot of people find very difficult to believe, no evidence that the BBC as a corporate body was aware of Savile's conduct. Of course, it wasn't just those who worked for the corporation who were aware of what was going on. Many high-profile celebrities would later claim that everybody knew what was going on, but because Savile was such a powerful and respected figure, they dared not blow the whistle for fear of reprisals. One such celebrity who claimed that he actually did attempt to alert the public to Savile's crimes was John Lydon, former frontman of the Sex Pistols. Speaking to Piers Morgan, he said, "I'm very, very bitter that the likes of Savile and the rest of them were allowed to continue. I did my bit, I said what I had to, but they didn't air that. I found myself banned from BBC Radio for quite a while for my contentious behaviour." The contentious behaviour to which he was referring came from a 1970 interview with BBC Radio in which Lydon claimed to have said that everybody knew what Jimmy was up to, but that they weren't allowed to talk about it. In lieu of Smith's report, the BBC issued various apologies to the victims, as well as promising to take various steps that would ensure nothing like that could ever happen again. But for many of Jimmy Savile's victims, it was a case of far too little, far too late. The fact remains that whether or not there was enough evidence to find the corporation legally culpable, more than enough people were aware of what was going on and could have put a stop to it. That they didn't, regardless of their reasons, is a direct betrayal of each and every one of his victims, a betrayal of basic human ethics, and a betrayal of everything that the BBC claimed to stand for. Often, people claim that when it comes to allegations against such a powerful individual, there is little to no point in voicing concerns because they will simply be ignored or covered up. But if everybody who retrospectively claimed to have known what was going on had gone public, then there is absolutely no way that Savile could have got away with it for so long. Ultimately, the BBC fell into an exceptionally familiar pattern of behaviour. Savile was popular, likeable, and above all, a serious ratings draw. As such, it was not in the BBC's best interest to publicly notice what he was doing, so be it consciously or otherwise, they didn't. This resulted in a scandal of such epic proportions that its true scope may never truly be known.